I'm County Supervisor Joe Simitian, and I'm pleased to be co-sponsoring this series with Asian Americans for Community Involvement, also known as AACI. And let me say thanks once again to Sarita Kohli, AACI's president and CEO, and in fact, her entire team for their collaboration in this effort, along with a great many supporting organizations from the community during this Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, including our Santa Clara County Library District. And before we get too far into the program this evening, I should mention that if you'd like to listen to this evening's panel in another language, please click on the interpretation symbol at the bottom of your screen and choose from the available languages, which are based on the registrations we received as of today. And if you want to continue in English, you don't need to do anything at all. You should be good to go. In our first two panels, for those of you who weren't able to join us previously, we talked a lot about the broad diversity of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community and discussed the 7 largest groups within that community here in the Bay Area: our Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Asian Indian, Vietnamese, Pacific Islander, and Filipino communities. Last week, we discussed the history and origin of prejudice and violence and what we can do about it. Building on those conversations, the purpose of tonight's panel is to better understand notions of identity, how the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities see themselves and describe themselves, also how the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities are seen and are described by others, and why it matters. And now let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Phillip Nguyen, who is president and CEO of World Affairs, formerly known as the World Affairs Council of Northern California, a San Francisco-based nonprofit whose programming presents a variety of views and opinions on topics bearing on global issues. Prior to joining World Affairs, Mr. Nguyen was a presidential appointee at the United States Department of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and working as a senior advisor to 2 U.S. coordinators for North Korea policy. Next, we have Thuy Nguyen, president of Foothill College right here in Santa Clara County. And at the age of 3, she and her family joined the waves of boat people who fled Vietnam after the war and eventually made her way to the United States. She received her undergraduate degree from Yale University and her law degree from UCLA, where she was a Paul and Daisy Soros for the New Americans Fellow and co-published 25 Vietnamese Americans in 25 years, which is archived in the Library of Congress and I'm told available at our San Jose Public Library. She is the first Vietnamese American college president in the United States. And our third panelist is a returning guest, Dr. Pawan Dhingra, a professor of American Studies at Amherst College and president-elect of the Association of Asian American Studies. He's the author of a number of books, including Managing Multicultural Lives, Asian Americans and the Challenge of Multiple Identities, a particularly good fit for tonight's conversation. And his most recent book, which I think has a tremendous title, Hyper-Education: Why Good Schools, Good Grades, and Good Behavior Are Not Enough. The views of the panelists are their own, and we're hoping to spark a lively give and take, a real conversation. Your questions are key to making that happen. So after I've asked a few opening questions for context, we will turn to audience questions. And I'm just going to ask that you type your questions in using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to submit anonymously, you can certainly select that option. We will not be using the raise hand function tonight. So again, we will not be using the raise hand function. Just use that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who are viewing via Facebook, simply type your questions into the comment box. All right, then, let's dive in. It's time to begin. Professor Dhingra, I want to start with you because the conversation is titled Notions of Identity, and I know a lot of your work has been in this area, in this field. Let me just start by asking sort of a threshold question, which is, what does identity mean in your experience and in your work? When we say, what is somebody's identity, what are we talking about, if I may ask?
First of all, thank you again for having me back. It's great to be on this evening's panel. And I appreciate, my heart goes out to the context in which many of you are living in a very visceral way as I sit here on the East Coast. And so I'm mindful of that. And to refer to the question then, Identity is how one sees oneself relative to others. It's a relatively straightforward concept, but one that carries a lot of meaning. So how I see myself is in terms of various parts of myself relative to some other people. And oftentimes identities help put us in groups, right? So I belong to a group, and that group is very meaningful to me as helping me understand some aspect of myself. And of course, ethnicity is part of that, but a lot of things are part of that. I'm a father. That's a core part of my identity. I think about that every day. I'm a professor. And so I think of myself as part of that group of people, professors. And so whenever topics come up related to this, I think about myself in that way, and it shapes what I say or how I respond or what I respond to. So identity helps define us. It distinguishes us from other people, people who are not professors, people who are not fathers, people who are not Asian Indian, but it also connects us to those groups at the same time. So it's a really key part of how we understand ourselves and how we go about our daily lives, how we go about our social lives, how we make decisions about whom to marry, where to live, what kind of jobs to get. All of these things are, who to vote for. All of these things are influenced by our various multiple intersecting identities.
Professor Dhingra, you talked about how notions of identity can connect people, but do notions of identity separate people? I think that's the right question of the moment in many respects.
The corollary, right, of connection is going to be division, or at least disconnection. And so if I identify with my geography as an American, let's say, then I'm distinguishing myself from non-Americans. If I identify as Asian American, I'm distinguishing myself from whites, African Americans, Latinx, and others. And so it does create disconnection. We can't say that it doesn't, because I'm connecting myself to certain people and I'm not connecting myself to other people. But the way to think about this is not that somehow identities are divisive, right? Identities do create belonging. And then the challenge becomes, how do we understand our connections with one another, even if we hold different identities, right? And there's different ways that happens. So I can think of myself as not as an Asian American, but as a person of color, and realize that I have connections with other people of color that may not be as strong as my connections with other Asian Americans or other Indians in particular, but are still meaningful, right? As a father, we can connect in different ways. So there's lots of ways in which identities do separate, but if we think about them in a slightly different way, we can find commonality that brings us together.
I think it was a couple of weeks ago, maybe last week, but I remember we had some conversation about the phrase Asian American and Pacific Islanders and whether or not that was a defining identity for a lot of folks in the United States and here in Santa Clara County, where we're convening tonight, or whether folks identified more by virtue of their individual ethnicities. And I know we had some conversation about the term Asian American being originally coined as an organizing tool. What's your take on that? If I were to, go out and talk to 100 different folks, would I get 100 different answers about sort of how people internalize their notions of identity around ethnicity as opposed to what some might describe as a Pan-Asian approach?
That's a great question. And I don't think you get 100 different answers. I think most people would say they identify more strongly with their particular ethnicity, right? Being Indian resonates in a way that being Asian does not. I'm married to a fellow Indian where our kids identify as Indian American. Their grandparents and such, family members. I worry about what's going on in COVID back in India. All of that has like a really deep connection and concern for me. I still identify as Asian and Asian American, but it's not as central to my notion of self as it is to be Indian. In fact, you could say that I appreciate what it means to be Asian American through my Asian Indianness. So that's what kind of gives me a connection to being Asian American. It's a more of an umbrella term, and it's meaningful to me, and it's been part of my professional, not just personal life. But on average, people connect more to their particular ethnic identity than to this pan-ethnic or pan-Asian identity. It can still be meaningful, don't get me wrong, But if we're talking about degrees of meaning, how significant it is, the being ethnic is more significant on average.
One more follow-up before I go to President Nguyen. Professor, I know you have spent time, in the literature and doing the research, and know quite well that there are folks who say, well, this focus on ethnicity can only serve to fracture our sense of community on a national basis, that if we want to see ourselves as one nation, a common people, that the focus on ethnicity is problematic. What's your take on that argument?
I vehemently disagree with it, and here's why. For me, one of the premises of America is e pluribus unum. So by definition, America has not been a place that in its ideal sense tries to say you must be only one kind of person to identify with this country. That has never been its ideal. Maybe in some ways it's practice, but it's never been its ideal. And so in that sense, I disagree with it. But I also think that how I connect to this country and how I actually can enjoy and appreciate living in this country is as an Asian American, as an Indian American, someone whose immigrant story is one that has a proud heritage and helps me identify with the country. In other words, to take away my Asianness, right, would be asking me to leave part of myself at the door in order to fit into this country. And if that's the case, then you really aren't going to accept me. You really don't want me here, right? If you want me here, and if I can, then therefore I can embrace this country and be more of a contributor back to the country, then you have to recognize my full self, and that involves my ethnicity and my background. That does not detract from my connection to the country. It gives me a way of connecting with and belonging to the country.
I really, what you said, Pawan, really resonates with me in the sense that I've identifying through my ethnicity, but through that is the larger beauty of which I then can see the fullness of everyone else. And so I very much appreciate that comment, because I very much identify as a Vietnamese American. As someone who was born in Vietnam. I came here when I was 3 as a refugee, as noted in my bio. And so I find myself often culturally, eating Vietnamese food, speaking in Vietnamese. I'm married to a Vietnamese American. And so my lived experience has very much been culturally, has a Vietnamese flair to it. And so being able to then appreciate the country as a new American, being an immigrant, that allows me to still identify as an American, but the connotation of an immigrant kind of experience, and still being able to comfortably live in that space.
I'm Korean American. I agree as well. I grew up in a small town in southeastern Ohio. Did not really have any interactions with Asians, let alone Korean Americans. There are very few, and I learned about being Korean and Korean American mainly when I was in college, and that's a very big part of me. And yet at the same time, I'm curious for both of you, being from Ohio, I found as I've gotten older, that's become increasingly a part of my identity as well. Maybe it's a way of me separating for all the Californians in certain ways, right? But to me, it's always been kind of a defining thing. Interesting, because most people, when they look at my face, they don't think Ohio, let alone southeastern Ohio. And so somehow it's a way for me to define myself and to maybe somehow differentiate myself from everyone else.
I did want to ask if Professor Nguyen hadn't had a chance. I'm curious, Professor, my recollection is there's something like 12,000 students at Foothill College. Am I remembering that right?
Just about, yeah.
And probably, a third or more are Asian American. Do they have a different take on these issues of identity by virtue of their time in life and their age?
So Foothill College, as you mentioned, has over 12,000 students, and a third of our student population, about 35%, are actually APIs, and it is now constituting the largest population, even surpassing the white student population. Our next student population is our Latinx student population, which is 27%. So we're very diverse college. And nevertheless, API, like the county, as you know, is now API the largest population. And it's very interesting because I did some data run for our conversation today. 1 in 5 API students at Foothill College are mixed race. And I think there's also another growing group of population around mixed race Asian APIs, and navigating the racial space and identity in that arena is quite fascinating in and of itself. Interestingly, our current student body president, that's our Association of Associated Students of Foothill College. Our current president is South Asian American from Santa Clara County, and our incoming president, Thuy is a Tongan American from East Palo Alto. And so how they navigate leadership also and their own identity is also very fascinating within that realm. I think when we talk about identity for students, especially for students, it's still a discovery mode. They're still discovering their identity because they're coming out of their house, their community, and even coming out of their neighborhood schools and going into spaces where there's much more diversity. And so their sense of identity is going to have to be discovered within that context. And it's very fascinating, even though we have APIs are the largest student population. Our Thuy has said that sometimes she feels very lonely being the few Tongan American, right? So she's navigating the identity just as I was when I was in college. And the largest mixed race at Foothill College API is with whites. And then the second is Latinx. Is you often, when we talk about race, whether it's in the context of just, the racial reckoning that's happening in our country, or when we have celebrations of heritage months, like today, this month being API Heritage Month, you will often hear students talk about how being mixed race has really helped them understand how race matters in this country, because they often talk about how they see the difference of one parent's experience navigating the world with the other parent. And if they look more like one parent than the other parent, they also have very different racialized lived experience. And so I think to that extent, they're much more in tune, I think, around the issue of race.
Professor Dhingra, what's your take on this growing community of multiracial students, young people, young adults? And
I think I really appreciate what President Nguyen said, that they can be very attuned to race in ways that others can't because they see it play off in their families in different ways. And one thing we know about how multiracial people identify, which is what's one of the big questions, right? We have all this growing multiracial population. How will they see themselves? Will they see themselves as, let's say, if one parent is white, the other one is API, will they identify as white, or will they identify as API, or will they identify as multiracial, right? And what we know is that how people identify, how multiracial kids and adults identify really depends on the context in which they're growing up. And it speaks to one truth about identity. Identities are not things that we just have inherently in us and we just pull out and just understand and realize. So much of how we understand ourselves is dependent on the context in which we grow up. Not just which identities we care about, but what those identities even mean. To be Korean American, growing up is very different in Southeast Ohio than it would be growing up in Koreatown. And so even the same identity, the same label has different meanings depending on the context in which how you're treated, you learn, how others define you. And so being multiracial is very much the same way. If you grow up among a lot of multiracial individuals, it's more likely you will identify as multiracial. That in and of itself will be a meaningful identity. But if you're one of the very few ones in your neighborhood and in your school, then you will gravitate more towards one of the categories of your background than the other. And which one you gravitate towards will depend on your parents, but also depend on how your classmates see you, how your teachers define you, how your soccer coach talks about you. All of these things influence the trajectory of multiracial individuals. And though it's hard to really say how they're going to identify because it depends on so many other factors. I actually had a question, if I may.
Please.
Excuse me. Phillip, when you were talking about how you didn't really think about your ethnicity much as Korean or Korean American until you got to college.
Yeah.
And that's oftentimes the case. A lot of people of color and Asian Americans in particular don't actively think about their background until something happens to them when they were a teenager, and college was a major space to dig deep into your ethnicity. You take classes about it, you want to learn a language, you want to go study abroad in your homeland. So my question for President Nguyen is, are you on the campus with so much diversity, are you seeing the APIs kind of stay amongst themselves because they're in this process of discovery and learning and self-interrogation? Or are you seeing a lot of people connecting across different groups? And that's how they're kind of they're understanding themselves in this kind of interconnected way.
Yeah, there is much, there's still the dynamic of where people sit in the cafeteria, in our dining hall, and how I observe where people sit in the clusters in terms of ethnicity. It is still noticeable, but quite frankly, it is not as noticeable as when I was growing up. Being a former desegregation lawyer, I particularly look for those types of scenarios, and I do see a little bit more mixture, but it's still very pronounced in terms of where people sit in the cafeteria.
Phillip, if I can ask a little bit about your own circumstance. I know you have multiracial youngsters. What's your take on this as a parent?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I was just thinking about that when Pawan was talking about all of this. It really matters context. I mean, growing up in Southeastern Ohio is very different from growing up in San Francisco. And so for me, it was interesting when he said that, if one of the children look more like one parent or the other, that has some influence here and there. There's also, and that's clearly the case. If I had to say, I've got a daughter and I've got a son, and my daughter definitely looks Asian, definitely very Asian. And my son, on the other hand, does not. And so for my daughter, it's been really interesting because everyone sees her, and when they see Joe, you know Melissa. She used to work for you. Melissa, has green eyes, and she has light brown hair, and they think Perry's adopted, right? They just can't believe that she's actually that Melissa's her birth mother. So that has an effect on her in different ways. The other interesting thing about my kids is they are in a Korean language immersion program here in San Francisco, a public school that they went through K-8. So theoretically, they took Korean for 9 years. My daughter took out after it like a fish in water. My son, on the other hand, kept on talking about it from the very beginning. I want to be an English immersion. I don't want to do Korean immersion. So, where this ends up, they're still fairly young, 16 and 13, I don't know, but it's a very interesting thing where, again, what Pawan, you say, context really, really does matter.
And the one thing that is also interesting to me as I observe my own lived experience and my own sense of identity is also how much, and it's absolutely right what Pawan said in terms of identity is how you introduce yourself to the world, but also how the world sees you. And that relativity is really important. And yet I know what my identity and how I really see myself when I see representation of myself. So say, for instance, whenever my family and I watch a movie, we stay for the credits to watch and see if there are any Vietnamese American names in the movie credits. And we get all happy and we cheer, et cetera, because we see representation. And it's similarly for our AAPI students at Foothill College. When they see me, they often feel that they can identify with me, even though they don't know me, but because they see representation and their own sense of identity, that gives them a sense of pride. And so identity also leans to that notion of pride too, that is very interesting.
Let me ask Phillip Nguyen, as we talk about these issues, I am mindful of the fact that over the years, America's place in the world has shifted, has changed vis-a-vis other nations from time to time. From your perch at World Affairs, what's the impact on the American view of the Asian American community?
Yeah, so that's something we've been giving a lot of thought to lately. As I said, I grew up in Ohio, I'm Korean American, and yet, I have a lot of friends who are in Ohio, which is a very different place from the Bay Area. But, one of the things I do find in common for the most part is that, most people in Ohio, a lot of them, and oftentimes here in California, don't put a priority necessarily on what goes on overseas. I think that's probably the case more so these days with all the craziness that's been going on the past year and the stuff that's happening here domestically. But I think, I've realized, and I've been thinking about this more, but for those of us who care about the past year in terms of violence on Asian Americans, I think there's really an undeniable connection to what's happening here inside the US and what's happening outside our borders. And so when I think about what's the connection, let me be really very plain as I can be. I think that when tensions escalate, what I've seen, when tensions escalate between the United States and an Asian rival overseas in some cases, Asian Americans or people of color become targets of anger, uncertainty. And I think this is really particularly true in times of rapid change and transition. And so there's a story. I interviewed Congressman Andy Kim, who's Korean American. He was telling this very heartwarming, just sad story about his son, who was 5 years old. And what he said was all these kids were going up to him, calling him Chinese boy, and saying these things to his son. And his son was coming back very confused. And Andy was saying that his son kept on saying, no, I'm not Chinese, I'm a New Jersey boy. Okay. When I heard that just took me back 50 some years, and I'm dating myself, to the mid 60s. I was 5 years old. Right. And I think about that time. World War II was within living memory for many people who had lived it. I was, kids were calling me Japanese ethnic slurs, right? And I didn't understand what that was. All I knew was that I wasn't Japanese. I knew that I was Korean. And my parents kept on saying, well, just tell them that your parents are Korean. Okay. And I didn't know even what the word parents meant, but I thought it explained everything about me being born in the United States and feeling like I'm really American. I have no idea what any of this is. And so, when you think about this, you have rivalry, the internment of Japanese Americans is one, awful example of how things that happen abroad somehow come back to Asian Americans. I think that another example was in the late 70s when Japan was starting to become a rival of the United States economically. You had in Detroit the Vincent Chen incident, where there was a Chinese American who was murdered and who was assaulted, and just terrible things had happened. They thought he was a Japanese, and he was Chinese American, right? You come back again of other examples. Wen Ho Lee, when there was concerns about China was just happening, Wen Ho Lee by our own government was prosecuted for espionage when in fact he had nothing to do with it, and the government had to issue an apology. 9/11, you have another example of Muslim Americans in a backlash. You can even talk about issues about immigration and migration and possibly the scapegoating of Mexican Americans. And now it comes back to China. And as it merges as a superpower, a rival economically, militarily, and COVID. And, heaven forbid what might happen if there is something found with this Wunan, biochemical lab or whatever. I fear that there's going to be even more backlash. So those are just sort of examples that I see that really makes it really important for us to understand and be aware of what's going on internationally, because it will come back and affect us.
And let me just follow up by asking, I know World Affairs is in significant measure devoted to fostering a greater understanding about world affairs. Would a greater understanding of world affairs have an impact here in the United States in terms of the way the Asian American community is perceived and or treated, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's really true, because somehow, it's the ideas. I call this, what did I call this? I call this the hyphenated American dilemma. And it's the idea that in the back of people's minds, because of how we look, we're really foreigners, you know? We're not somehow really American, and somehow our patriotism is questioned. And so what I see this is the impact, unfortunately, is that our ability to speak out on really important issues is limited, lest, you know, we get attacked for some reason or another. And so, you know, it is really understanding that there is this difference between, you know, country and the people who are there, and those of us who live here, who are not, you know, it's a different kind of identity.
Let me follow up on this, because this issue of American enough, this issue of being perceived as foreign or the other, comes up a lot in the conversations I have with friends and colleagues. Professor Dhingra, can you put some more meat on the bones on that part of the conversation? I mean, what's your understanding? What can you share with us about sort of where that comes from, what that's about, how it plays out in people's daily lives? And then I want to ask Professor Nguyen, you know, is that an issue on her campus? So first to you, though, Professor.
That's a great question, and I really appreciate, Phillip, how you're talking about the Asian American experience in kind of a global way, and what happens over there, right, impacts how we're seen and how we're treated over here. And in that sense, right, Asian Americans are kind of represent kind of how the international is never just does not have a border, right? We are a walking border in that regard. Whether or not, even if we identify as American fully, right, we still represent two sides of a continent or a coin, whether or not we want to, right? And in that way, it fits a trajectory of Asian Americans that's been since the inception. So Asian American, one of the truisms across Asian American history, and you talked about this a bit, I think, on your last panel, is that Asian Americans always get seen as a potential foreigner, always being seen as having to prove our Americanness. I remember I was at a CVS in the Boston area where I used to live, and I was wearing my New England Patriots shirt that one of my kids gave me, right? I think for Father's Day, actually. Even though I don't like the Patriots, I promise. Anyway, I was wearing the shirt. I'm at CVS, you know, it's an average weekend. And, you know, and then all of a sudden this person comes in, and then we're end up talking, and he doesn't like what I say. And I don't care for what he says. And he says to me, you know, basically unprompted, well, maybe you should go back to where you came from. I'm like, I'm literally in the Boston area wearing a New England Patriots jersey. I'm not sure what you want me to do, right? And I didn't, you know, I don't carry that around or anything per se, but the point is, this is the kind of there's always the presumption of foreignness that's not going to come out of, you know, just out of any conversation. But when things are not going well, when there's a concern over my place or my presence or my legitimacy, right, then it's more likely to come out of the blue. And education can be helpful in this, right, in educating about Asia, but also educating about American history, American creation, and Asians in America. But I mean, I don't think education can solve this problem, but it is a meaningful step in the right direction.
Things likely to be more fraught when the economy is not going well. I'm thinking back to Phillip Young's comments about a certain time when Japan was viewed as a major economic competitor on the global scene. You know,
it's completely true. And Phillip, you did great. Thank you for kind of walking us through the Vincent Chin murder, 9/11, and this COVID moment, back to World War II. I refer to those moments as the tip of the iceberg. You know, and what I mean by that is, you know, we're at major inflection points. World War II, we're under attack. The economy is under attack in the 70s and 80s. We're under attack in 9/11, and we're under biological attack of some kind now. When Americans feel under attack, we look to find an enemy within, sadly. And Asian Americans often become the enemy within. But I refer to those inflection points, those major issues, as the tip of the iceberg, because that's what we see. It's very visible. We can't. It's obvious that Asian Americans are being harassed and attacked now. It's obvious what happened after 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. But like any iceberg, The bulk of it is under the water and we don't see it. But that's where a lot of the kind of experiences of Asian Americans as not American enough, not too foreign, having to prove your loyalty, that's where a lot of those microaggressions take place under the water. They're not hate crimes. They're not going to go viral, right? There's no, you can't really point it out and say and blame someone or accuse someone of what they did, but you know it when you've experienced it. I'll give you one quick example and I'll stop, which is in my latest book, Hyper-Education, that you mentioned, a lot of the parents, Asian immigrant parents in this, doing very well in school, the kids are doing just fine in school. They're kind of living the American dream in that regard. They were still referred to as, in fact, doing too well by their white teachers and educators and school principals, which I find really strange. Here we have educators referring to kids as doing too well in school, as if that's possible, right? It's a concept I find is confusing. But again, it's the way in which Asian Americans are thought of, you're not really fitting in, you're not like us, and therefore you're a problem. And that kind of always being seen as having to prove yourself as one of us, of having to always be doing the exact right thing, even though we don't decide what that is, right? It's an arbitrary kind of assumption by others, is how a lot of the under the water experiences of being a foreigner take place.
So Joe, let me add to that. I think that in a sense, as we talk about identity, I think that is something, if I had to make a sweeping statement about those, about the different ethnic groups and minorities and people of color, in certain respects, I think that is somewhat unique, much more unique to perhaps the Asian experience, maybe, is the fact that it is this notion of foreignness, right? And we have to grapple with that on so many different levels. And half the time we don't even know that that's what's going on, right? The story that I have, which is has so many implications for policy and where you go and what we do, and is I was at the State Department and I was working on North Korea related issues, and when I was there, it was a fairly homogenous place. It was starting to transition a little bit as I was there, but I was still, there weren't that many ethnic and minorities at the department at that time. And I was, for a variety of reasons, fortune, whatever, I was on the more senior side. And I was given the North Korea portfolio. And I had the good fortune of having a couple of, one really amazing mentor who was a career senior Foreign Service officer who was very experienced. And when he found out I was doing that portfolio on North Korea, he was great, and he was saying how happy he was that I had this opportunity to make a difference and make an impact. But he also took, he kind of took me aside and said, you've got to be careful. He goes, people are going to look at your face. And when you go into different agencies in Washington, D.C., they're going to look at you and they're going to make certain assumptions about you. So, you're going to have to be pretty careful about what you decide to advocate for and when, and you have to be very savvy about it. And it was the best piece of advice he ever gave me in terms of what I could do and what I couldn't do, because policy and politics is the art of possible. And but there was something there that was palpable, and in the sense to the point that one of my mentors basically gave me a heads up.
I want to underscore what Phil said earlier around just what's going on in world politics and how it affects how Asian Americans are treated in the United States. When I gathered groups of Asian American students at Foothill College, and they asked, and I was checking in on them, how you're doing with this rise in anti-Asian hate. I was getting reports of students having real mental health breakdowns because of what was happening in his neighborhood, in one example in San Jose, et cetera. And so the emotions, the mental stressors of the rise in anti-Asian hate is very real. And what was interesting as we were gathering this group of Asian American students to create a support network for each other, it wasn't like, a Vietnamese American or a Korean American said, that's not our problem, let's help our Chinese American. We all all the students understood that they were in the same boat. And it's because they knew that the mistaken of the anger for Chinese Americans of the virus was also going to be on them, very similar to what happened with the Vincent Chin. It did not take much learning of history to understand that. So what does that mean? That means our students have been living in this environment and they know that one cannot tell the difference between a certain Korean American Phillip and a Chinese American, for instance, right? And so that says a lot. That's deep that students know that that level of racism and mistakenness is there. And then they also talked about being seen as a foreigner. And, it breaks my heart because I think we really have to redefine what it means to be an American. The experience that I had growing up, speaking Vietnamese, watching the Vietnamese dub Kung Fu dramas. That's probably why I love K-drama at this point. All of that experience is American. Even though I didn't watch Disney shows or what, that is still very American. And I think that's one thing we have to really explore is just also redefining what America means, so that one is not seen as a foreigner, as different. And interestingly, if we really dig into everyone's history, personal or family history, the similarities are amazing. Right, that constitutes what is American, with few exceptions. And so, I often say in Vietnamese, "Bầu ơi, thương lấy bí cùng, tuy rằng khác giống nhưng chung một giàn," which means, "Oh, melon, please remember to love the gourd, even though you are from different seeds, you're from the same vine." And so our lived experience is actually very American. There's nothing foreign about it.
As I listen to this conversation, I, of course, am prompted then to say, if on the one hand, there is this this notion of foreignness, how does that square with the model minority phrase that is much in the conversation these days, and I think has been lifted up as a source of frustration and even anger by a lot of folks in the community, because that descriptor is off-putting for reasons of its own. Who wants to weigh in on the model minority appellation here?
Just one sentence, and I'd love to hear from Phil and Pawan, is who's the minority now? I mean, at Foothill College, APIs are not the minority anymore, right? It's the largest group, and in Santa Clara County, likewise.
I like that what you just said. Who's the minority now? You said at Foothill College, API is the largest group, and we look about the public schools in Santa Clara is a great example of this. The area that Asian Americans often are seen as the highest achievers, like in these schools. And as I was referring to in the book Hypereducation, that doesn't always mean that they're applauded for that, right? There can be a lot of resentment and pushback for being the so-called model minority, and a lot of pressure, a lot of academic pressure going on, a lot of resentment, and a lot of confusion. But the problem is that when Asian Americans are doing well in school or in work or elsewhere, and they're seen as the model minority, what helps explain their achievement, according to the stereotype, is in part their foreignness. Our foreign culture somehow helps explain why we do so well in math and science, why we are so committed to education. And like you're seen as naturally smart, as if somehow you carry that with you just by being Asian. So the notion of Asian Americans being foreigners and the notion of Asian Americans being model minority, they're not separate concepts. They're very much connected, because a model minority stereotype assumes some kind of foreignness to the person. You're not one of us, right? You may be doing well, we may applaud you for doing well, you're a model, but what lets you do well is your hard work and everything else, but you get that from some kind of foreign aspect of yourself. And so while we applaud you, we're still suspicious of you. And we still have to be wary of you, because you might take your great skills and your great accomplishments and end up turning against us and becoming the enemy within. And so Asian Americans often have to battle with this dualness of being appraised and being suspect, right, at the same time.
So Joe, my take on this is when you say model minority as in good, that implies that there is a not model minority, thus bad. And so when I think about that the clarifying moment for me when I think about all of this that kind of opened my eyes in a way that I had not seen before was the 1992 riots in Los Angeles. And, there were scores of people who were killed, thousands were injured, hundreds, even more were arrested. And it was really depicted in the media as really a Black versus Korean American rivalry here and battle. It was this craziness that just pitted two communities against each other, when in fact you go to the Warren report, which had been 20 years before, or almost 30 years before, laid out what are the things that had happened, what needed to happen to prevent the Watts riots, and nothing really actually had occurred. And so in effect, what was really the shortcoming of American society and those in power for not doing something over a period of time, and did nothing, somehow it was depicted as really the result of the Korean American community doing certain things to the African American community or vice versa. That's not to say no one is blameless in any way, but that's how it was depicted. And quite frankly, is because of lack of diversity in these newsrooms that didn't really see it any other way. So I think there's that element of there with the model minority as a way to pit different minority groups against each other and look at things as a zero sum. And I think that's been very unfortunate.
I think you may have said Warren report when you were referring to the Kerner Commission. Am I remembering
exactly
correctly? Thank you.
Yeah.
You're testing my historic skills now as well, but thank you. Thank you for that.
You get an A in history.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
When we think about first of all, I didn't know I was model minority until, much later. And then someone said the term. And so it's not like we lived through this experience. We still have the kinds of struggles, for me, growing up in public housing, growing up in urban communities, growing up first in my family to go to college. There's still so many things that are and honestly, so many that are struggling. Pawan talked about the high achieving Asian American communities, but it's also the complete opposite. It's the lowest and poorest of the community is in the Asian American community at the same time. What is disheartening about the comment of model minority is also it takes away the responsibility of institutions. And so say, for instance, with Foothill College, it takes away the responsibility of looking at structural things that are happening, that are creating the disparity. It takes away the responsibility of communities to really be reflective of why is there such a differences in success according to their perception. Instead of saying it's because of them, why not reflect on our own systems, our own way of doing things, and why is there even that difference if we perceive it to be one?
And Professor Dhingra, do you see this in your students? You teach now at Amherst, as I recall. You've had other assignments and other venues. What's your? I guess the question for all of you. Forgive me, I'm going to lean in on this a little bit and just say, when you talk to a lot of folks, they say, well, things are a mess, but I put my hopes in the next generation. That's a pretty heavy burden to put on the next generation. What do you think? Is it different?
I think the current generation, and this, we're talking about college students. Of course, most people don't go to college, but I'll keep that in mind. As President Nguyen said, they get it in a way that, when I was in college X number of years ago, I won't exactly say when, we weren't as conversant in some of these issues. And of course, we were, more conversant than our previous generation. So every generation is more aware of kind of on the ground realities around stereotypes, around pressures that are being forced to live up to, and everything else that are false or that are misleading. But just because you know something is false or misleading doesn't mean you can escape it. Just because I know, or our current students know, that as Asian Americans, they're seen as a model minority, that's a ridiculous stereotype, it's not true, doesn't mean that they can escape some of the mental health burdens that come with that notion, right? And so there's a lot of awareness, a lot of wokeness, right, if you will. They're more articulate in what the problems are, but they're at the same time, in some ways, they're carrying deeper, like emotional burdens than I did when I was in college, right? So I don't want to paint it as kind of a linear trajectory of, generational improvement or the like. The stresses that students are under now, in K through 12, forget not even 12, third graders. I talked to parents, I talked to teachers who said that third graders would be in their classrooms and would be nonverbal. They're experiencing so much stress of academics placed on them by their parents or by their teachers or someone else. And we see that in the Boston area, seeing that in California, in the Bay Area, seeing it everywhere, right? And that burden gets understood as a model minority problem, but it's not. It's well beyond that. And they're carrying that burden all the way up. So they can know it's a false stereotype. They can be very woke about these things. They can be very aware of sexuality and gender and all these things that weren't really on the top of people's minds a generation ago, but they can't necessarily escape like the expectations and the emotional tolls that it takes.
President Nguyen, Phillip.
Oh, absolutely agree with Povid. The mental health needs in the API community is very high. And part of the challenge as a college president is to help provide resources, racial trauma informed psych counselors in that arena also, and culturally responsive counseling in that area. And then on the student side, to try to destigmatize mental health in a way so that students can reach out and get support and get understanding from their family why they need that support. And so the mental health need in the API community is actually really high. That said, my hope is still with them. It is extraordinary. We had our Research and Service Leadership Symposium last week, and there were research projects, original research projects by students. And the way students talk about race and racism in America, the way students talk about their mindfulness and their role and their place and the policy discussions around it. They may not know the Warren report, but they know and have a really deep understanding that is extraordinary, and it didn't come from class. You can tell it came from lived experience, no matter what race. And so that's where I feel the hope of the future is going to be.
Can I tie this back to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Phillip.
Yeah, let me just say, let me just sort of dovetail with what Thuy was talking about. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I think that this time right now, as I've said before in many other iterations, we're in the midst of epic change. And I think we're going through a transition society-wide globally that is going to create opportunities that the younger people are going to be able to take advantage of much more quickly and much more easily than someone of my age. And what I do look at when I think about, the last time we had this kind of epic change, I think about the turn of the century, around the 1890s, 1880s, when I think there are very similar circumstances where you had huge income disparity, you had a lot of polarization of society, you had huge technological change. And yet what you saw was the progressive movement, all these different sort of groups of people moving forward, trying and experimenting. And that's why when I see the young people that I've talked to and I see their commitment and I see them going out with Black Lives Matter, and I just feel like this is something different. And I think that if that is that the change that is going to happen is going to come from them because of their willingness to experiment and their willingness to try something different and not be held back. And so, I think my and our generation's obligation is to enable that as much as we can. That's what we can do right now.
I just want to quickly refer back to something that President Nguyen said around the mental health concerns, and in tying it back to our conversation around identity. And arguably, right, Asian Americans. This is a generalization, but there's a kernel of truth to it, that Asian Americans don't seek mental health support as much as they should, and there's an assumption that by doing so, it's not really what we as a people do. We as Chinese or Indians or Vietnamese, we don't seek mental health in our culture, right? That's maybe what other people do, but we don't, and they should. And what I want to say is, this is in some ways the limits or the problems of identity. If you could have aspects of your identity, your ethnicity, for instance, that actually could hold you back from seeking services and resources that you should. Because if we say to ourselves, oh, as Indians, we think mental health counseling, all that kind of stuff that's what Westerners do. And you take care of that stuff in your own family and you figure it out on your own. You don't seek a professional. That's what crazy people do. We're not crazy, right? If that's what it means to be, in some ways, what our ethnicity means to us, then our identity, in some respects, right, if that's what it means to us, can be limiting. So when we talk about identity, it's not always something we should just, applaud and praise and blanket in like uncritical ways. We should be mindful that when identity can be helpful and when it actually can keep us from doing things we should be doing.
So, Professor, does that mean, though, that ethnicity and identity done right in some respects really opens up the possibility for all of us to pick and choose and to have a richer experience, because we have the multiplicity of ethnicities and experiences and cultures and histories, and we can say, you know what, there's a lot I can learn over here, there's a lot I can learn over there, and some of it may be relatively superficial, some of it could be absolutely essential. Thoughts?
Completely. I completely agree, right? This notion of hybridity, something that we talk about a lot, which is that I have parts of myself that
I can tell you, no one has talked with me about hybridity any time in the recent past. So why don't you talk with us about hybridity? I'm quite serious, because I think I know where you're going, and I think it will be a helpful part of this conversation. Go to it.
We want to move away from thinking about any culture as somehow authentic and inherent and beyond time and not historically created. What it means to my grandparents, I think an older generation, okay, as an example, what it means to them to be Indian, right, is not what it meant to their grandparents to be Indian, right? It's always changing. And if we know that to be true, then we can't say that there's an inherent Indianness or inherent Koreanness or inherent Vietnameseness or anything. And if that's true, then your point makes a lot of sense. It's something we should embrace, that when we come to a new country or a new environment, we should be thinking, well, what about this new place and its ways of life are things that we should be embracing and incorporating into who we are as a family or as a person or as a community, and not assume that our way that we inherited from back when is somehow timeless and always good. And if we have that more open mindset, as I would tell my kids, a growth mindset, then you allow for having elements of this part and that part and something else, and you create a hybrid notion of self, one that is not connected or limited by one group versus another group. We get away from that kind of thinking as either this or that. A hybrid notion of self says it's a both and, right? And it's not easy to do that, because if I have both and, if I'm somewhat Indian and I'm somewhat American, then people may say, well, you're not really Indian, right? And then I have to deal with that kind of conversation. But the people only say that if they have a relatively narrow and fixed understanding of what it means to be of an ethnic group. And we ourselves, not just society at large, communities themselves have to get away from this narrow notion of what it means to be of your group.
Let me ask this next question, and I'm going to go to audience questions right away because we got a number now that are starting to come in, and thank you for that. Because Professor Nguyen used a term in passing. She referenced cultural competency. And, you know, I'm one of 5 county supervisors in a county government where we provide a range of services, healthcare services, social welfare services, and a plethora of others to a very diverse county. And there's a lot of concern, and I would say commitment, to providing those services in a way that is described as culturally competent. But I worry a little that in an effort to be culturally competent, that that can sometimes perhaps slide into stereotyping.
It's a good comment. I mean, when coming to the United States when I was 3 years old, I don't have any memory of my plight from Vietnam. My first memory is jumping on the bed in Wichita, Kansas, seeing 10 little monkeys jumping on the bed. One fell off and bumped his head. The mama called the doctor. You know where that goes. The thing is, my mom would not call the doctor because I often find myself and my siblings having to interpret for her at doctor's visits. You know, even as of late, we're the ones setting up the COVID-19 vaccination appointments for them. I'm even as of late interacting with insurance companies, et cetera. And so the cultural competency, including language competency, has been absolutely helpful, that I no longer have to go to my mom's, doctor's appointments to hear some of those things and interpret all of that part. And so that's been helpful. But then there are times when we would get something in the mail that's entirely in Vietnamese, and we said, what makes you think we can't speak English, et cetera. So there is that dynamic, absolutely. But I take that anytime if services are provided for my parents that are culturally competent so that they can navigate the world and are not so dependent on me.
Got it. And I should give a quick shout out here to the folks at AACI who are co-sponsors, Asian Americans for Community Involvement. They are our partners here at Santa Clara County in making sure we provide services in just that way, and are at the moment undertaking an effort that my office and I have been working with them on to make sure that we have an Asian and Pacific Islander outreach team out there to make sure that underserved populations do in fact have access, and that language is not a barrier, and that other barriers are removed. So to your point altogether, with a shout out, as I say, to the folks at AACI. I've got some questions and I want to try and fold them in. And here's one I know that you all will have some opinions on. Questioner asks, I'm curious about how Pacific Islanders' experiences might be different. I know there is discussion about how these groups connect to the larger Asian American collective. I see you nodding your head, Professor Nguyen. Why don't I let you lead on that one?
Oh, I would love to hear from our other professor, Professor Pawan Dhingra. There's no doubt Pacific Islanders navigate the world very different from Asian Americans, and sometimes it's so important when we talk about APIs to really connote the differences, and quite frankly, I'm learning. I'm trying to learn more about the experience of Pacific Islanders, especially ones that are U.S. territories, or ones that identify more with indigenous people in terms of what constitutes foreign now, right? In terms of being non-American, and then also, I recall when we were doing an exercise of professional development of the color line. And it's through an exercise of trying to identify, giving yourselves points around how privileged you are. And then if you stand in line based on your score of that, you see the color line. And you almost all the time see Pacific Islanders very close to Latinx and Black Americans than with Chinese Americans or even Vietnamese Americans. So the lived experience of privilege for Pacific Islanders is very different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really well put. I love that color line reference as a kind of a way of embodying that difference. And we know that Pacific Islanders have, as you already alluded to, much more in common, or at least more in common with Native Americans and indigenous populations. And one of the reasons why that matters in terms of an AAPI conversation is that Asian Americans are not necessarily aligned with Pacific Islanders. And often you could even argue, and people do argue, that as Asians, settled in Hawaii, right, and other islands, they were kind of like a colonizing force on the islands, right? And so it's arguably Asian Americans and many Asian immigrants have a position relative to Pacific Islanders that's not collegial, that's not peer oriented, right? And so there can be a lot of tensions, and all the more reason not to conflate the experiences as all connected. It's the question that the audience is asking is really helpful, because it really draws attention to how the relationships are different, immigration-wise and historically, and education levels today are different, income levels are different, identities can be different, cultures can be different, and not just in a general way, in a very meaningful way, right? So it's not surprising that the color line of people standing has Pacific Islanders much more aligned with Black and Latinx populations than with other Asian Americans.
Let me ask you this question before we move on, just as a follow-up. Here we are in Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, nationally decreed and decreed here in our county and in the state. Is that a misnomer? Should we put Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month to rest or restructure it in some way?
I think there's an open conversation of how much Pacific Islanders should be connected with Asian American. I'm not the authority on this, and so I won't weigh in per se. But I think that either way, the Pacific Islander experience needs to be attended to on its own. That is to say, it can't be as an addendum to an Asian American framed conversation to do it justice. So whether it's along with other populations or not, I'll leave it there, yeah.
We have a question here from someone who says, and this revisits a little bit the earlier conversation, how do these identity issues change when there are larger or smaller numbers of people who are like? And it says, I expect being Vietnamese in San Jose is different than being Vietnamese in Fargo, as an example.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm going to hand that off first. I only felt the need to get off because of the reference to Vietnamese Americans.
Phillip, you want to speak about being Korean in Ohio versus Korean in San Francisco?
Yeah. Let me, how can I share some of these? So for me, and again, this is all anecdotal. This is all I can say for me, right? Growing up in Ohio, where there are very few Asians, let alone Korean Americans, and as I struggle with my own identity, there was this whole notion of not wanting to be foreign, wanting to be being seen as American. So my viewpoint of things was very much from an American, white American perspective. And that was, I have to say at that point in time was sort of the aspiration for me. As I got older and I ventured out and saw different parts of the world, that did change without doubt. And being Asian American and being Korean American became a very important part of my identity. But as you're talking about, hybridization is the way I looked at it. My viewpoint was one in which, I looked at it as a plus, right? I got to do more things because of that and still stayed where I was. So I thought I found the right balance for me. I think what I found for Asian Americans for Korean Americans, where there was a large Korean American population, you found one of two things. And this is my, again, just based on my experiences, you found people who were very much part of the Korean American community and part of that group of people and stayed fairly insular on that because it was something that was very familiar depending on when they were born, where they were, their population. Or you found people who, were tired of it and wanted to get away from it as quickly as possible. So, and that is kind of the lived experience for me, where you saw people who were then all grappling, all of us at the same time, with what it meant to be Korean, Korean American, Asian, different, okay? And all of us found different places to be along the continuum, whether it was being viewed pretty much as an American and really not having to do with your culture, or being totally immersed. And I think it's a continuum, and I think that it just varies.
You know, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, in a village in New Orleans that is sort of an enclave of Vietnamese refugees. And so my schooling in my elementary school was pretty much 80% plus Vietnamese Americans. I felt very much identified as Vietnamese Americans, but it was more picking up that culture. And then when I moved to Oakland, I was only probably one of 20 Asian Americans in an inner city school that was largely Black. And so I picked up that identity of being an inner city kid, and navigated the world in understanding what urban culture and urban struggles were like. And so there is, though, one general sentiment in the Vietnamese American community that it's really important not to be insular, and to really be engaged and integrate and acculturate, not assimilate, but acculturate, or at least that's the goal. There have been in earlier years this real desire to assimilate. So don't speak Vietnamese at home, learn English only, really, be part of American culture, assimilation. But I think that nowadays there's much more of a general desire to acculturate. That means to be able to navigate the larger society, but still bring your own flavor and ingredients to the table, so to speak.
Was that village in New Orleans called Versailles?
Yes, Versailles.
All right. There is a clear interest here, because I've got a number of questions around the issue of mixed race, mixed ethnicity. One questioner says, most of my friends are in mixed ethnicity marriages. As so many school-age children are now mixed race, how does that change identity? We talked about that a little already, but when you're asked for your race or ethnic group, how do mixed race people answer that question? And what's the difference between mixed race, multiracial, and biracial? So, Professor, we're going to go to the professor for the taxonomy here. So let's start there.
I brought some graphs for this. So how would someone identify if they're asked their race? And I hate this answer because it's it comes across as a cop-out, but it actually is the best answer to give, which is it depends, which is that to say, depending on how they've come to see themselves racially, based on, as Phillip mentioned earlier, right, what your parents, how you look phenotypically. Do I look really Asian, as you said one of your kids does, but your other kid does not? And if you look really Asian, you're going to be treated as Asian by people who don't know you, by your classmates, by coaches, by anyone else. And that may then make you feel more Asian. So when I get asked what I am, I may say Asian. Right? That depends. That would not be surprising. But if you're in a school or a community with lots of multiracial people, and that's kind of a known thing that, we are multiracial, and you're asked how you identify, you may list all of your races, or you may say multiracial. It's really hard to pigeonhole this because it depends on so many personal factors, your own parents and what they taught you. You may look a certain way, but your mother, who is Japanese, may have really, really instilled in you a lot of Japanese traditions, culture, expectations, myths, stories, religion, all these things. And so someone asks you who you are, you really feel Japanese because your mother's Japanese and she's raised you in that way. There's so many things that go into this. It's hard to give a single answer. And the other part of the question was what again?
Well, it was, is there a difference between mixed race,
multiracial,
and biracial?
So, I mean, I guess between mixed race and multiracial, I think are generally synonymous. One, I think has a nicer sound to it, which is multiracial. Mixed sounds like you were mixed up, and which is has a pejorative notions of one's notion of self as a multiracial child. Biracial refers to two. So you go, some people have more than one background that they're referring to. You can be, your one parent can be biracial, the other parent can be monoracial of a different race. So if you have three races in your life, you wouldn't call yourself biracial, because that's bi only means two. So this gets kind of specific and, on the verge of, less likely, but yeah, that would be my answer. If you don't know anything, say multiracial and you won't screw up. That's my piece of advice.
We have a question that I think is also thought-provoking, which is, do we hold on to one identity or another out of habit or out of fear? And how do we overcome the uncertainty of being open to hybridity? So we're back to hybridity, Professor, but the question, it's interesting to me because it says, do we hold on to one identity or another out of habit or out of fear? Interestingly, it doesn't say or out of pride or out of happiness, or which I am struck by. But let me just reframe the question slightly and say, is there an answer to that question, which is, why do we hold on to our identities and rather than let them perhaps shift, ebb, morph, whatever, change? Thoughts?
I can start us off, but I'll try to be brief, which is to say, we hold on to identities because they give meaning to us. They help us understand our place in the world. And we may hold on to them too long, that is to say, that they help us understand who we are, but who we are may have changed, but we're not recognizing that. And we're holding on to a version of self that's a bit outdated. And that's true regardless of ethnicity or anything else. That's, there's a lot of ways in which we may hold on to the past, if you will, longer than it's useful. But identities are a way for us to understand who we are relative to others, so it gives us a sense of place, sense of belonging, right? So they're really meaningful. I wouldn't think of them as holding on to them out of fear. No, I wouldn't go down that road.
And is what you just said, Professor, applicable to other kinds of identity? A professional identity. Holding on to being a lawyer, being an educator.
I held on to the identity of being a cyclist 5-7 years after I'd done any meaningful biking, right? But it was so meaningful to me. And I realized, you know what? I'm holding on to this, and I haven't done, a bike ride over 30 miles in 5 years. I can't keep calling myself a cyclist anymore. It's an embarrassing thing to say. Either I could get a bike on the bike or I drop the identity. I ended up dropping the identity, much to my chagrin.
I must say, it's interesting, even the phrasing of holding on to an identity. I don't really see that as a holding on. And it's interesting, Supervisor, you mentioned, why is it not pride instead? And that's how I see it. In Silicon Valley, in the Vietnamese American community, there's a phrase called "chồng tech vợ ly," and it means husband and wife in tech and assembly. And it's a phrase in the Vietnamese American community in Silicon Valley, in the pride that it has in building Silicon Valley. And so it's this notion of identity for the sake of pride. But at the same time, being a first Vietnamese American college president in the country, noting that identity speaks, when you hear that, you speak to, wow, there's not more. And wow, she must have a certain type of experience because of being first. And so it does connote certain things, not only a level of pride, but also a level of potential struggle or potential path and journey that is distinct and noteworthy. So I wouldn't say I'm holding on to identity in that way. And definitely identity has multiple layers, as Pawan has described.
I want to try and squeeze in two more questions if I can. And what are ways that our community institutions can help us understand identity? For people who'd like to get better educated, what do you recommend?
I recommend doing something that I really appreciated you did 4 years ago, roughly, when the country politically was turning in a certain way. And you made a point to really go out there and travel into spaces and places that to better understand. And that is the most important thing, is diversity is our strength as a country. It brings about innovation. It brings about just a level of wealth and richness that I'm proud to be an American for that reason. And I just can't imagine being in other places because of the richness and wealth that comes from diversity. And so take advantage of that and really actually engage and befriend and be with people and talk in deep ways the way you are doing this with us, so that we can really learn from each other and connect more deeply with each other. That's the recommendation.
All right, I'm gonna let that be the final word on that question, because I have a question I wanna ask all three of you. And we'll close with this. We started, Professor Dhingra, I remember you reminded us that it was e pluribus unum, from many one. Is it possible in an increasingly diverse country to create a sense of unity in diversity? And if so, what will it take to get us there? Just take a few seconds each to think, and then I'll go to whoever raises their brave hand first.
All right, I'll do it.
Thank you, Phillip.
Okay, so this may be more considering about the bigger picture process rather than anything specific, but I think a really important observation in all of this is that, words matter. Words matter a lot, and people forget that. I mean, we've seen a lot of what words can do over the last 4 years in particular, but words generally matter a lot. Leadership matters an incredible amount. And, Joe, this is, a tribute to your leadership that you're taking this on. And I think that matters. My viewpoint is very practical. We see all these terrible things going on to our community, and, what is it that we can do? And so that's the one sort of, if I say, insight that we need to keep remembering, that what we do, how we do it, is going to make the difference in all the things that we were talking about here today.
President Nguyen?
Absolutely, it's possible within diversity that we can find unity, because if we all recognize diversity is our strength, then that is our unity. If we know that it is strategic for a country to constantly innovate, it is strategic in the sense of being a place that's connected to the world in all different ways. If we see the strategy and the smartness that America has in its immigration and creating that diversity, then we'll know that then that is our unity, that is our strength. So, and that's the same, I see that in my own work with management, of diversifying management, diversifying our students. We see things that come out about that is much more beautiful as a product.
And Professor Pawan Dhingra, I'm going to give you the last word on the notion of unity and diversity, and whether it's achievable, and if so, how, here in the United States.
Before I logged on this evening, I was at my son's baseball game. They lost, just in case you're curious. But despite the loss, the baseball team makes sense to me as an analogy for unity through diversity. We don't want a country full of outfielders only, or just second basemen, or just catchers, or even just pitchers, right? You're not going to have a team. You're not going to do anything unless you have people in all the positions. And that's not to say that we have some groups over here and some groups over there and some groups over there, but diversity is essential, right, for progress. And so there's no reason why ethnic diversity and racial diversity can't be part of what lets this country progress, if we, right, are really committed to equity and treating people fairly, giving everybody an equal chance for success.
Well, thank you. We couldn't have scripted it better than for you to invoke America's pastime as the vehicle to unity and diversity. I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank everyone who took time to be with us tonight. Thanks for working through some of our technical glitches with us and hanging in. I certainly thought it was an illuminating conversation, and I am guessing that our listeners and participants did as well. Thank you again to our friends at AACI, Asian Americans for Community Involvement, for co-hosting. And I hope that as a consequence of this conversation, all these conversations, each of us takes away a deeper understanding of the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience. For those of you who would like to listen to the panel again, or either one of the two previous panels, or share them with a friend or a colleague, easy to do. Just visit www.supervisorsimitian.org and you will find them right there and available. I want to just end by reinforcing the last question and the comments from all of our panelists. I think our ability to live and work and prosper together in a diverse community begins and ends with understanding. And that's why this series has been called Understanding the Asian American and Pacific Islander Experience. Thanks and good night.